Hello, and welcome to the pre-concert talk prior to the final concert of the Reno Phil's 2020-2021 season. I'm Chris Morrison. I write the program notes for the Reno Phil, and with me, of course, music director and conductor of the Reno Phil, Laura Jackson. Laura.
Hello, Chris.
Hello.
So wonderful to see you.
Wonderful to see you as well. And I just mentioned the final concert of the current season, and congratulations on the fact that given everything that's been happening in the last year, the Reno Phil followed through and created an entire season for people to enjoy. Quite an accomplishment.
I am so thrilled about this, and I am so proud of everybody that, on stage and behind the scenes that has made everything come together, that we have been able to make music and offer it to the community during this whole time. It has sustained me, and I think helped sustain our musicians, and hopefully sustained our patrons as well.
And it so happens that this last concert of the season is going to be the first concert of the season to feature all of the major sections of the orchestra, not on stage at the same time. We're not quite to that point yet, but the strings, woodwinds, brass, and percussion are all featured, which is really fun.
Yes, yeah, I'm so thrilled about this because it's a wonderful way to end the season. It's, you see everybody. So we'll start with the Copland's fanfare, and we'll have the brass and percussion together. And then the second piece, we get to bring our woodwinds back as a section. We had 3 individuals that played sonatas earlier in the year, but this is the first time we've had them as a group, and they're playing an octet. So that's really, really special. And then the second half of the concert is all strings, and we have as the highlight of the whole program is Ruth Lenz, our fabulous concertmaster.
So we'll begin with the brass and percussion and a famous piece by Aaron Copland, Fanfare for the Common Man.
Yes, indeed. One of the most, I think, iconic melodies, certainly by Copland, but I think in all of Western music, it is one of the most recognizable themes. And there's something about it that just sort of awakens the American spirit, I think. People really can relate to this. There's a boldness, a grandeur in that opening statement of the percussion, and then when the trumpets come in, it's just really, really wonderful.
It was written right in the middle of World War II and was intended as a patriotic gesture.
It was, yes. It was the Cincinnati Symphony, and Eugene Goossens was the music director, and they commissioned a bunch, actually 18 different fanfares that would, start different concerts, and it was really to sort of rouse the camaraderie and nationalistic spirit. And in any case, this is the piece that Copland wrote. And what's interesting is that he was contemplating various titles, and he heard a speech by Vice President Henry Wallace, who coined the century. This is the century of the common man. And Copland was really inspired by that speech and by that phrase. So he decided on Fanfare for the Common Man.
Shall we listen to a moment of the piece, just to sort of get us in the mood?
Yes.
Obviously stirring music. In fact, Copland was so impressed with his own piece that he returned to it when he wrote his 3rd symphony not long after this, and it becomes kind of the basis of the last movement of that symphony.
It is indeed, and it's wonderful that he used such great music. He found a way to repurpose it, so to speak.
There's one silly little anecdote regarding Fanfare for the Common Man that I might as well mention. I put it into the program notes, but this piece was going to lead off the first concert of the Cincinnati Symphony's 1942 season. It was going to get its world premiere in October of 1942. Copland hadn't managed to finish it on time, so they rescheduled it for March of 1943. And the orchestra pointed out to him that this was the middle of income tax season. And Copland wrote back and said, "I am more than happy to honor the common man during income tax time." And as it happens, since the deadline for filing individual income tax returns has been extended into May, we are following through on that historical precedent and presenting this music in honor of the taxpayers of America.
Hear, hear.
Yes.
I think it's fabulous.
So that leads us off. Then we move to the woodwind section that you were mentioning, and the Serenade in C minor by Mozart. a really special and kind of unusual piece for wind ensemble.
Yes, indeed. You know, when we think of a serenade, we think of music that was written for outdoors, for an entertainment setting to be sort of lovely background music for a party, perhaps.
Yeah, it's a common genre back then.
Yes, indeed. And this serenade is so not that.
Yeah.
It has this, it's in a minor key, it has this intensity, this storminess throughout most of the piece, except for that second movement of the four movements. It really has a driving intensity to it that is so gripping. And it makes you stop and listen, which is exactly what serenade music typically was not at the time.
Yeah, but if you look back into music history in the second half, basically, of the 18th century, there were tons of pieces written called divertimento, serenade, nocturne, partita, and they were basically meant to be background music. A famous example everybody will know is Eine kleine Nachtmusik.
Which of course, we played on the First Classics Concert of the Year.
Right, its actual name is Serenade. And this piece, 99% of the time, these serenades are meant to be, you can listen to them and get great enjoyment out of them, but they also sit safely in the background for a dinner party or a wedding or something like that. But this C minor serenade of Mozart kind of grabs you and holds on to you. It doesn't fit well into the background.
Yes, that is absolutely the case. And so the beginning opens with this arpeggio, C minor, everybody's in unison, and there's just a power to it that actually reminds me a little bit of the opening of the Copland, oddly enough. It has a similarity, everybody's in unison. And it showcases the oboe in a wonderful way in this first movement, but the whole thing is more like the first movement of a symphony than it is a serenade, and it's truly wonderful. And and actually, we have an excerpt of that movement. Maybe we'll listen to that now.
Yeah, a little bit of the first movement.
So from there, we have the second movement, which is actually the most serene of all four, and it's just very lovely, slow movement in 3/8. And then we have a minuet and trio for the third movement, and that is a canon. So it's like a row, row, row your boat, where the melody is comes, staggered a bar apart, and it ends up being quite cerebral and dissonant, but also bold and intense. So it's really very interesting. And then we make our way to the last movement, which is a theme and variations. Again, a more of a symphonic kind of form.
Yeah, let's listen to a moment of that. This is part of the fourth movement. Kind of rhythmically playful, but that minor key tonality gives it an interesting character.
Yes, and so that was the theme. Then we go through a whole series of variations that are takeoffs on that theme. And it's not until the very, very end, the coda, where it's almost like Mozart just bursts out laughing. It goes to a major key, and it has this very happy, joyful ending to the whole thing.
That's almost funny, but it definitely puts a smile on the face.
Absolutely.
And then we move into the concerto on the program, the violin concerto in A major by Joseph Boulogne, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges.
Yes. It's a bit of a mouthful, quite a sentence
is.
there, yes. And my understanding is his original name was Joseph Boulogne, but then he earned Chevalier de Saint-Georges because he was not only a fabulous musician, violinist, virtuoso, but he was also an incredible athlete.
Yes.
And particularly as a fencer. So this is how he got the Chevalier title, am I right?
That is all correct. Actually, if you want to check out the Wikipedia entry on the Chevalier, somebody should make a movie of his life. I know it's been turned into a novel in the 1840s.
I think a movie is being made, as a
I
matter of
am
fact.
not surprised to hear that. Yes, he was born in the islands of Guadeloupe.
Yep.
His father was a plantation owner. His mom was one of the slaves on the plantation. Under those circumstances, it was not uncommon for the father to just disavow the child. But in this case, that didn't happen.
Yes.
And the father actually took both of them to Paris. And Joseph Boulogne, as he was known then, got full training. He became really well known in his teens as a fencer. He got an obscure amount of music education. It's not exactly clear what his education was. He may have studied with Jean-Marie Leclerc, who was one of the great violinists of the time. But in any case, by his late teens and early 20s, he was serving as concertmaster in an orchestra. He made his debut in his mid-20s, playing 2 of his violin concertos of his own, so he was obviously composing by then. He became the music director later of the Loge Olympique, which was probably the most prestigious orchestra in Paris at the time. And for those of us who are lovers of the music of Franz Joseph Haydn, we owe the Chevalier and his orchestra a great debt of gratitude because they were the ones that commissioned Haydn's so-called Paris symphonies, numbers 82 to 87, which are great pieces, and they were premiered by the Chevalier and his orchestra.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of impact that he had as an artistic leader and performer is just really tremendous, and even more miraculous coming from the background that he did in that day.
Yes.
It's really, really something.
Yeah, in fact, he was slated to become the music director of the Paris Opera, but that was an occasion where his mixed-race background did not serve him well. There were a couple of prominent patrons of the opera that weren't comfortable with the idea, and he ended up not getting the job. But he was a much celebrated person in Parisian life at that time. Even I ran across a quote from President John Adams, who became acquainted with him in Paris, saying that he was the most accomplished man in Europe in riding, fencing, dancing, shooting, and music.
Oh my goodness. You know, there are stories of people that knew him as an athlete. They would be absolutely astonished when he would walk out on stage with a violin in his hands, and then vice versa. People would know him as a musician, and they would see him swimming across the Seine, or, you know.
Never mind the fact that he also fought in the French Revolution. He fought in the Haitian Civil War for independence. He led the first all-black regiment in Europe, which became known as the Legion of Saint-Georges, due to him. Just an amazing life that he packed into his, I think he died at the age of 54 or something like that. And he wrote all of this music, some of which is still being rediscovered. I was reading about his operas. Despite the fact that he didn't get the job with the Paris Opera, his operas were performed in Paris a lot, but only one of them survives, and it got its first modern performance last year. So there's still music out there waiting to be rediscovered by Saint-Georges, including many violin concertos, one of which we're going to be hearing in this performance.
Exactly, yes, he has symphonies, violin concertos, chamber music, all kinds of things, and a lot of it was written, most of it was written for him to play as, you know, part of. So we have this delightful violin concerto, and I have known about these concertos for a while because of Rachel Barton Pine, who is a wonderful violin soloist who has been here a couple of times. She played the Brahms violin concerto, told us all about her violin, and she came back again a couple of years ago. She is a great champion of Chevalier de Saint-Georges, his music and his concertos. And I actually have a whole stack of CDs in my house of the concertos that she has recorded. So anyway, I didn't know them really intimately, and I went and started exploring them. And I just threw it out to Ruth. We were thinking of different things that we could do, different types of concertos that we could do. And the minute Ruth heard this piece, she fell absolutely in love. She was like, we must, capital letters, do this piece. We must do this concerto. So that was really a delight. It was like handing somebody a novel that they had never read, and then they're, you know, just light up. And,
yeah, that's another wonderful part of this performance. Not only are we going to hear this still seldom heard, but really great violin concerto, but our featured soloist is the concertmaster of the Reno Phil, Ruth Lenz, and that is a delight all by itself.
It is always, always a delight to feature her. She's such an enormous talent and such a pillar of leadership and strength in this institution and in this orchestra that it's just great to have a spotlight on her.
And you have had a chance to speak with her as well.
Yes, indeed, yes. Ruth, it is such a pleasure to have you here with us today and to be featuring you this week with this concerto. Welcome.
Thanks, Laura. I'm really excited.
Yay. It's really great. It's a wonderful piece. It's been wonderful for both of us to discover this concerto.
Yeah.
And, before we get into the piece specifically, I just want to talk for a second about your role as concertmaster, because that's a very special role in the orchestra. You are really the head musician, the leader. You are the one that tunes the orchestra. What is part of being a concertmaster? What is that about?
I think one of the things I do, I decide which direction the string section's bows go. So we all have to go this way or this way together. So whatever pattern that is, I'm the one that kind of initiates, the bowing process. So that's one thing. And then another thing I do, I feel like I'm kind of the interpreter between the conductor and the orchestra, because you will show us a motion and I decide if you're asking for something to be short and light or maybe more smooth, or if you want us to get louder. So I try to see what you want, and then everyone watches me to see what I decided, and they play with me. So,
right.
Yeah.
So you're translating, the sort of gestalt that I'm trying to come up with, and then putting that into technical terms that translates it to the orchestra. That's
Yeah.
exactly it. And the bow is really like a paintbrush. I mean, there's so much when you're deciding whether a bow goes up or down, you're really deciding the string sound, the personality of this orchestra. There's a lot to do with your bowing choices. So I love that about what you do and how you make the strings really shine in the orchestra. So now if we turn to this piece, this wonderful concerto, I just tossed it up. We were talking about several different concertos that we might put on this concert. And tell me about your first impressions when you listened to this piece.
It made me really happy. I loved how joyful it was, and I felt like that was just a perfect piece for this time. And I liked how it contrasted with the Tchaikovsky, and it also sounded really fun, although I was a little worried when I heard some of the virtuosic stuff. I wanted to try it and make sure I thought I could, play it myself after I practiced it. And it's difficult, but it's also very fun to play once you've practiced it.
That's great. It's wonderful when you are playing a work that is well written for your instrument, right?
Yes.
When you play a concerto by somebody who played himself, as Chevalier de Saint-Georges did. He was writing this concerto, among others, for himself to perform. And he was, as you were saying, the writing is very virtuosic and challenging, and that's because he was clearly a very, very gifted violinist.
Yes.
So we have these three movements, and it starts with this kind of long introduction where you are playing with the orchestra, and you're not highlighted in a special thing. You're actually playing the tutti part with us. And that's a typical kind of thing that was done in classical era, as in a la Mozart's era, concertos of that day, right? But soon after we finish our little introduction, the orchestra seems to kind of back away into very basic accompaniment, and then you begin to really shine.
Yeah.
So the writing in the first movement, some of it is quite high, some of it is very lyrical.
It's beautiful, and it's nice because of the way the orchestra texture is, I never feel like I have to battle to be heard. I can play with a sound that just floats out of my violin and not have to press or worry about projecting. Yeah,
that's often a real challenge in playing a concerto. When you think about it, it's this one instrument that is set against all of these instruments on stage, and particularly when you have a full orchestra with winds and brass, it's even more challenging. So you feel like you're kind of shouting all the time in order to just be heard over the texture. And here we are in this socially distanced setup where people are pushed to the back of the stage, and it's kind of a relief to have simple writing in the texture of accompaniment so that everybody can really listen to you and play as a chamber musician.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then we have the largo, and you told me earlier that this is one of your favorites.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I love the way the harmonies work together. Sometimes you're expecting it to go one way, but it cadences in a different way, so it's a surprise. And I like how he wrote really uncharacteristically high for the violin in this movement. The melody goes really high. And when I was practicing it, my dog noticed that I was playing higher than I usually play. He was looking at me and, what is that? But it's, I'm hoping that it's going to sound like this effortless floating and not like a dog whistle.
No, it definitely does have a suspended kind of floating quality to it, and you're up above the clouds in a certain way. It's really lovely. And then we come to the rondo, the third movement. And of course, a rondo is this A, B, A, C, A, D. And the A is something familiar that keeps coming back. It's like a layer cake, where you have different kinds of filling for each layer between the cakes, something like that. So you get to play the contrasting segments between the A sections. And here is where the virtuosity really comes into play, right? Is in the third movement.
Yeah. There's a thing near the end. I was actually listening to Rachel Barton Pine talk about it, and she said that Bologna was a fencer, and she said she feels like a fencer when she plays this thing at the end because you're sword fighting with your bow. You're going across like that, and you'll see when I'm playing, it looks like I'm jabbing something over there and then coming back really far. And it's
maybe I'll be glad that we have to be a little further apart than usual. I'll be at a safe distance from this jabbing bow.
Yeah, violin by fencing.
Exactly. So there's also this technique called bariolage. And maybe if you can just describe that a little bit more. I mean, you were just doing a bit of it, but what exactly is that?
Bariolage is Italian for rocking, and the bow is rocking across the violin. So in the first movement, you'll hear this bariolage passage. That kind of pattern where it sounds like you're playing a lot of fast fingers, but it's actually your bow going across the strings that creates the speed of the notes.
And then there's this other thing that you have to do that's playing tense, and it's like a finger split, right? Your fingers are spread really far.
It's like yoga for your fingers, and violinists, usually the furthest we have to reach is an octave, which is like A to A, B to B. The 10th, instead of going B to B, you'll go B to there. And that's a big, you can see my fingers having to reach back and up, and I feel it all in here. And in the Bologna, you have to do a whole string of them with bariolage. So I'm not going to sound very good right now, but you kind of, that kind of thing where you have to go down and be moving your bow really fast. And
it's athletic for both hands.
It's athletic. You have to work out to get ready to play that. You can't just try to play it the first, at least I can't. I can't play it the first time like right now. And so
you have to be well warmed up, like a ballet dancer doing other warm-up exercises. Oh, well, it's just a delightful piece to be rehearsing and playing, and always such a thrill to feature you. So thank you so much for taking this on and doing this with us, and best wishes.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Just violin and string orchestra, we should point out, in this piece.
Yes, the first movement of this concerto has quite a lengthy orchestral introduction, but Ruth plays along with the orchestra, which is really nice. And then she launches into these virtuoso passages. It was really fun when she first was looking at the piece and falling in love with it. She said, wait a minute, before I commit to doing this, I need to look at this, because a lot of it is really hard. I want to make sure it's playable. And then, of course, anything is playable for Ruth. So she called back and she was like, yes, absolutely, I can do it. It's interesting to hear that example, because Ruth plays it almost twice as fast as that, because she is just an unstoppable virtuoso. She's really perfect to be showcasing in this particular concerto. And now we have a little bit of the third movement as well, the rondo.
Yes. the violin is kept very busy.
It is indeed, yes. And just, it's delightful all the way through. The second movement is a lovely, lovely largo where she has these just expansive melodies soaring over gently pulsating strings beneath. And it's just, it's simple, lovely, and always ebullient in a certain way, even when it's quiet. It's lovely.
So that's the middle work on the program, the concerto.
Yes.
And in this program, the third work highlights the strings of the Reno fill again, and one of the masterworks for a string orchestra, and that is the Serenade for Strings by Tchaikovsky.
I am so excited to do this piece. I love this piece so much. You know, I grew up listening to it as a violinist myself, and then I went off to school to study violin at a boarding school, North Carolina School of the Arts in Winston-Salem. And while I was there, I was 16, I got my first opportunity to play in a professional orchestra, the Winston-Salem Symphony. And on the program was the Tchaikovsky Serenade. And I was just so ecstatic and, of course, incredibly nervous as well, because here I was going to sit amongst all these professionals. And I will just never forget the experience of reading it that first night and hearing how these melodies just dance from one section of the orchestra to the next, handing it off like a relay race, and the sweep of the beautiful melodies. It was an incredible, incredible experience to be in the middle of, and that just enhanced my love for the piece ever since then. And then, you know, just realizing it on stage as we rehearse it, it's just magnificent.
Yeah. And it comes out of a kind of troubled period in Tchaikovsky's life. Speaking of a life that requires a book-length study or a really good film, or he had a very event-filled life. And not to go into the entire story, but Tchaikovsky was gay, wanted to keep it quiet in the very conservative society in which he was living, and decided for the public's sake, really, to get married to a woman. And it did not work out well, ended up in some sort of mental breakdown, a suicide attempt. And so Tchaikovsky, in this state, decided to get out of town, so to speak. So he went off to his sister's estate. His sister and her husband owned an estate outside Kyiv, out in the middle of nowhere. And Tchaikovsky worked away on two different pieces. One of them is the famous 1812 Overture, which Tchaikovsky himself hated. He
so
called it
funny.
He had to write it, but he called it noisy and of no artistic value. And the other was the Serenade for Strings. And sometimes, as you read about Tchaikovsky, he had sometimes real struggles putting together pieces. It would take him years to figure out just what kind of form it should take. He would rewrite things. That didn't happen with the Serenade for Strings. He wrote it quickly in a couple of months. He loved it. He felt it was his tribute to Mozart, his favorite composer. Yeah. And it turned out just as he wanted it to, basically.
And he had this patroness in his life that was supporting his composition endeavors. They never met, but they had a very sort of intimate, emotional relationship via correspondence. And he wrote a letter to her saying, you know, I've just written these two pieces, and one is bombastic, and I put no really amount of my heart into it, so I think it's pretty much worthless. But this Serenade, I not only love Mozart's music, I idolize him as a composer, and so I'm writing this Serenade, you know, in the style of Mozart. So, you know, he invested quite a lot of himself. What is so interesting to me is that even though he's trying, in a sense, imitating Mozart, it is so totally Tchaikovsky. You know,
yeah, it doesn't really sound like Mozart much at all, even though that might have been what was going through his head at the time.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, of course it's restrained in forces because it's just a string serenade. And there are classical elements about the ways that the melodies, play back and forth. But basically, Tchaikovsky, one of the most wonderful things about doing Tchaikovsky's music is how honest he is as a composer, how his heart is right out there. There is so much passion in his music. So there's just something unbridled about a life force that just comes out no matter what. And it is very, very much Tchaikovsky's music. There's a beautiful melancholy. There is, some of the most beautiful melodic writing you will ever hear in any music. And that, I have a special affinity for Tchaikovsky in terms of interpreting his music and doing it. And I think that that's really what it is. It's the beauty of his melodic writing and the artistic honesty in his music.
And he shows that right from the very beginning of the piece. The first movement, actually, he referred to that as writing it in Mozartian style. But you listen to the beginning of the first movement, which we will right now, and this is pure Tchaikovsky.
Indeed.
Just this wonderful outpouring of heartfelt melody.
Yes, it's an interesting thing to interpret that. He writes, sempre marcatissimo, always marked, very marked. And at the same time, you have to sustain the notes, which means you can't make them bell-like in a
Right.
marcato style. So you already have a little bit of a contradiction, but what he's getting at is intensity. He wants it to be absolutely right out there in front of you, intense and intensely beautiful.
Then the second movement, the first movement concludes. The second movement, it's actually set up kind of like a symphony, where you get a little dance music in the middle and a slow movement in the middle. The second movement is the dance. It's a waltz. And as we know from Swan Lake and the Nutcracker and Sleeping Beauty, Tchaikovsky had a way with dance music, and he put a little dance music into the second movement.
He certainly did. He could write a waltz like nobody else. You
Yes,
know?
let's listen to just a little hint of that.
Let's do it.
He just had a way with melody.
He
That
did,
guy.
indeed. The elasticity of it, the give and take, how it speeds up and slows down is definitely Tchaikovsky.
And then after that, we get the third movement, a slow movement, and then the fourth movement, finale, in which Tchaikovsky, there's debate whether this is an actual folk song that he used or maybe a version of a folk song that he came across, but he actually employs another melody in the fourth movement.
He does, and he starts with this very simple iteration of this folk-like melody in the beginning. I think, do you have the beginning of
We
this
do,
movement?
yeah, the beginning of the fourth movement. How true it is, I don't know, but the story is that Tchaikovsky heard something like this melody being sung by Volga boatmen, guys who are hauling barges down the Volga River. And he heard this tune and thought, and he came up with something like that melody, or maybe his own version of that melody, as part of the capstone of the fourth movement. Although the beginning of the first movement does recur toward the end, giving the piece a wonderful sort of symmetry before the really lively conclusion.
Yes, yes, indeed. The fact that the introduction music at the beginning comes back several times, actually. It comes back at the end of the first movement and then comes back again at the end of the last movement is a very Tchaikovsky-like sort of a trait, and it gives it a grandeur, sort of a book ending of grandeur that's really, really wonderful.
When you're conducting a string orchestra that is socially distanced like this, are there specific kinds of challenges when you're facing, a great masterwork like the Tchaikovsky Serenade, in terms of having everybody seated so far apart from one another? Does the sound change? Does your approach have to change at all?
Well, it's interesting. We have a couple of challenges. I would say one is a very practical one. We don't have stand partners, and there's nobody there to turn the pages. You wouldn't believe how different that is. Usually, one person can keep playing the part. Their stand partner, this is in the string section, their stand partner can turn the page, and you still carry the line. Now we have our librarian doing all kinds of things to Xerox extra pages because everybody's on their own music stand. The other issue that we deal with is ensemble, which is playing together. It's already a challenge on any concert hall stage to hear across when you're making your own sound, okay? The minute you're making loud noise, it's hard to hear what people are doing way over there. It's particularly challenging when we are spread out like this. But what's beautiful about it is how everybody is so intent on rising to the occasion and not making any concession in the quality of the music that we make. We are not being safe in our tempos. We're not being safe in the rubato, the give and take of speeding up, slowing down. We're really taking risks and going for it. And I am so appreciative of the musicians that they are meeting me with that goal, that we're really doing that together. And it's incredibly rewarding.
So you've chosen quite an attractive program. We get the nice brass fanfare at the beginning, a marvelous little known, but I think everybody will love, violin concerto in the middle with our own Ruth Lenz, and then the richness and melodic imagination and the just surely wonderful quality of the Tchaikovsky.
Yes, I really can't wait. It's going to be a delight.
Thank you very much, Laura.
And thank you, Chris.
And thanks to all of you for tuning in for the pre-concert talk. Please do enjoy the music.